Welcome. You are listening to Sharegiving Secrets with Deborah Greenhut. If you are a family caregiver or expect to be one, and you want to maintain your well-being while caring, then you are in the right place. I am your host, Deborah Greenhut, speaker, author, and rational caregiver advocate. I'm a family caregiving veteran, bringing you survival secrets and experiences from experts who share the goal of doing less by managing more. We need to invent and reinvent family care, and together we're going to do it. My big idea is rational caregiving, and my motto is, let your brain lead your heart. Please share yours in the comments. Sharegiving Secrets, because friends don't let friends be caregivers alone. Let's do this. Hello.
Hi,
Glad you with me. Hi, how are you, Eliezer?
I'm good. How you doing, Deborah?
I'm doing fine, thanks. And today we have a very interesting interview coming up. Eliezer is the author of The Silver Linings of Alzheimer's, and we have a lot to talk about as far as caregiving goes. So, my first question for you, Eliezer, is how would you begin describing the moment when caregiving chose you?
Huh. Um, I was actually filling out a some sort of legal form regarding insurance or something like that, and it got to the occupation question. And all my life, I would fill that in with writer, editor, or teacher, which were the three main things I've done most of my life. I'm 73 now. And without thinking, I just wrote in that space caregiver. And it took me by surprise. I said, huh? And then I realized, yeah, I guess that's what I am now because I was doing it full time. So I couldn't, you know, that's what I was. And then I thought to myself, well, I guess next time I'll just write son because that's son, because that's really what I'm being in life right now. That's when it first occurred to me that my fundamental identity had shifted without telling me.
So actually it shifted back maybe a little into something you always were, but hadn't put on your forms before if you became the son rather than the caregiver. Interesting. Now, you said that you've told me that your mother had perfect vital signs and perfect blood labs, and she wasn't ready for hospice at 95, and yet here you are, caregiver. How did that medical reality, your mom's actual good health, reshaped your expectations of what the long haul was going to be?
Well, my older brother and I would confer a lot about her status, and he was 5, 6 hours away, so I was on the front lines every day. But I don't want to mislead you or anybody. The, it was sort of hands-on at the very beginning. Well, my father was very hands-on, and I wasn't even in the picture when I moved in with him to help him because he started having his own issues. Uh, he assumed that she was having a miserable life full of suffering with no quality of life at all. And he even thought, she would get pneumonia periodically. And he even thought next time she gets pneumonia, let's not treat it. Let's let her have a graceful ending because there's no life there. Whereas I was living in the house and I saw plenty of life and I didn't see any suffering. She was, as you said, in very good health because she used to call herself an AAD, almost a doctor, because she read all the prevention magazines and watched her diet and exercise. So she was in excellent health. So she wasn't suffering physically. She was barely on any medications. I was on far more than she was. And And in terms of her emotional and mental state, she didn't indicate she was suffering there either. At least, there were times she had Alzheimer's for 20 years. So we saw all the stages that most people are familiar with, including the horrible ones, the violent ones, and the nutty ones. But by and large, um, the the further she was into the disease, the more she dropped her past and her memories as a Holocaust survivor and whatever had shaped her persona. As that stuff dropped away, she emerged as what I imagined to be the little girl she was before the Nazis came in, and she was radiant. She was loving, she was open, she was laughing a lot, and she would greet everybody in the house with the same kind of openness and love. And it was astounding for me. I'd not witnessed that side of my mother, and maybe when I was a kid, little kid, but not in decades. So I was delighted, and any lingering issues I had had with her in my adult life just vanished, and I fell in love with my own mother in a way that I hadn't felt since I was maybe 3, 4 years old, and I felt it back from her. So there was a lot of quality of life until the very end. I'd have to say the last 3 years she was more or less in oblivion, with very little contact or connection, except a little moment of eye contact where she might register that I was there. So I asked her doctor, should we stop treating her if she gets pneumonia again? And like you said, the doctor said she's not ready. She's not actively dying. Her physical health is fine. We're going to keep treating. So I just, because she wasn't suffering, I just rode with it. And I wasn't a hands-on caregiver for 20 years by far. My father was for about 8 years. Then we finally convinced him to bring an aide in, and he only let her come in 2 hours in the morning. Then the aide needed an aide to get my mother ready in the morning because it was a tough job. And my brother and I used to listen to my father through the bathroom door, shouting and struggling and fighting, and it was insane. But it still took 2 years for us to convince him to get help. And that help gradually expanded to a mini nursing home with a full staff of 8 aides coming and going, visiting doctors, and at that point, I was a care manager, not a caregiver, really. I was managing the household and the hirings and the firings and the doctor's appointments and the medicines, but I wasn't doing the hands-on in the trenches work. The aides were doing that.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the expectations we may have had when we were in our 20s or 30s about what life would be like when we're in our 70s and our parents maybe make it till their 90s, all of that's been overturned. And I have to confess, from my side of it, I am getting over the shock of people saying to me, well, you're this well for your age. Your bones are really good for your age. And I'm
Right.
thinking, I'm just the same person. I can't get my head around how I'm supposed to be according to some chart or something. And I'm not even sure doctors have a really good handle on what this means because nobody was living as long as we are all living now when we were growing up. So the idea of an old lady or an old man is, just in not in the right zone anymore. Something's wrong with that picture. And we tend to give up on people because we've been used to that. So a lot of surprises in that narrative.
We had a lot of longevity in our family. My mother's mother lived to 94, my father's until 97, and then my dad passed at 93, my mom at almost 96, and they had been married near the end. By the time my father passed, he was 1 month short of 70 years of marriage. So it's an unusual situation. Um,
It's it seems a long time to most of us. My whole family, no one has ever lived past 80. So at 74, I'm starting to wonder what the future holds. We'll see. Um, Now, your memoir focuses on the joy and the laughter that you mentioned, and that there was some unexpected healing in the middle of a disease that many people fear. I think you've given us a little bit of that picture and how you fell in love with your mother again, as having been for many years. What were some of the first signs for you, though, that your caregiving story wasn't going to fit the usual trend.
Well, a lot of my closest friends would check in on me and ask about my mother, and often their main question that they were afraid to ask, I could tell they would just kind of be nervous and hesitant, and they would come out with, "Well, does she still know who you are?" And as if I said no, that was the worst thing they could imagine. And the truth was, I came to realize organically, I wasn't thinking about this, but it started to dawn on me that it didn't matter to me that she didn't know my name anymore, that she didn't recognize me as her son or that we were related. And what emerged in its place of our story together of at that point 60 years was a sense of underlying connection. And that was, it just dawned on me, that's the most important thing. If I feel connected and I feel her feeling connected, we were happy. I was happy. And the content, my name, our relationship, our history, our story, none of that mattered to me anymore. I wasn't attached to it. And so I think that answers what you asked me.
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're talking about is how um, identity and connection um, change radically when the memory falls away. It comes from a very different source than remembering a particular story. I think you also mentioned that people enjoyed your daily bits of humor and even some hilarious moments in the caregiving journey with Alzheimer's. Could you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah, I mean, at least one to five times a day, there was a moment that I'm glad I wrote down so that I could include it in my book, The Silver Linings of Alzheimer's. Um, they were just little moments, but they were crazy. Like we were sitting at the table for dinner, and she would pick a piece of lettuce out of her salad, put it on the table, flatten it out like she was ironing the wrinkles out. And when she was happy with how it was, she would point to it and go, "This is not a normal person." And I told this story to my friend, and he said, "Well, you know something? She's absolutely right. That was not a normal person." And another kitchen table story is she picked up a jar of a glass of apple juice, and was studying it in the light, turning it, clinking it with a fork and listening. And she finally finished her examination, put it down, and looked up at us and said, "I wonder what size brassiere she wears or it wears." You know, and another kitchen, there were, I guess a lot of these were at the kitchen table. The phone rang and it was over her shoulder. So she picked it up and we just watched. And she said, "No, we're okay. We're just here selling all the chickens." And we said, "Mom, who is it?" And they said, "Okay, okay." And she hung up. We never knew who it was. And we said, "Mom, what was that about?" And she goes, "Oh, it was just all about the pillows and the teeth. It's okay." So, there were many, many little moments like that.
So I caught you saying also that you had a lot of little notes. Did that help you with the writing of the book? I know it's hard to
Well,
get time
yeah,
if you're a caregiver.
yeah, I couldn't have written it because as had I not taken notes, I couldn't have written the book at all. Yeah.
I've heard that from a lot of authors who have been caregivers. It was all in the little notes. I have had an app that I used, Evernote, not advertising for it, but it helped me to keep track of things I really needed to remember. As long as I gave the note the right heading so I could find it again. But it's a struggle sometimes to keep all the details straight. There are a lot. Now, we we were going to talk a little bit about teachable lessons for caregivers.
Right.
So one of the first things I know I found a lot of difficulty with this because if something was said wrong, I would always at first snap in and say, no, it's this. And the essential rule I've heard is never argue with their reality. What helped you internalize that? I would love to know because I really had a hard time with that.
The thing that helped me the most was watching what happened when my father didn't do that. When he was the first year to two, he was constantly correcting her experience of reality to assert the truth. So, and I knew, lesson number one, like you said, is you don't correct the patient. You don't tell them they're wrong. You don't try to convince them of something that they're not experiencing. Um, so my brother and we would listen to them shouting and fighting and him correcting her, and it was terrible. I mean, to be in the presence of all this conflict with someone who was innocent, it'd be like watching someone fight with a cat. Who has no idea what you're talking about. So my brother and I would take my father downstairs and very patiently, slowly try to teach him or even train him that with someone like my mom, she's always right, no matter what she says. Make that your mantra. Mom is always right. And he said, okay, I got it. And he'd go upstairs, and literally within minutes, we'd hear him screaming something like, and this was a real event. Of course, you have a sister. Her name is Gerda. You just spoke to her on the phone 5 minutes ago. And so I would come up to try to calm the waters, and my mother grabbed my elbow and pulled me aside and kind of whispered conspiratorially, I think there's something wrong with your father. He's been acting very strange lately. And I just laughed because it was bittersweet, it was poignant, but it was also funny that through her eyes, he was the nutty one, right?
Yeah, it sounds like
Ob-
you have to accept a new proposition there about who is the sane one.
And obviously, it was harder for my dad to adjust after 60 years of a constant partner than I, who, would see them a few times a year, and I lived far away. So it was easier for me to see what was happening with more objectivity.
Yeah, the constant drain of of having to forgo and forget things that are happening around you, which are disturbing and in many ways must be hard for the for spouses to live through. I shouldn't say must be. I know that it is.
Right.
Um, Now, you spoke also powerfully in the book about reframing, about how you move through grief until you can meet this new person who is still trying to live in your home. Could you talk about reframing for us?
Sure. Well, again, I'll use my dad as an example. For the longest time, he was clinging to who she had been, and that person was slowly disappearing. Their memories together. And he couldn't stand it. He kept trying to force her back to his version of the wife he knew. But and that's a grief process. I even compared it. I don't know if I'm sure you're aware, in the 70s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had 5 stages of grief. And the first one was denial. And my father was in huge denial to the point where my mother became incontinent, which is very common with Alzheimer's, especially in a 90-year-old. So rather than get her Depends, which was the simple solution, he would he couldn't tolerate that notion that his wife would be wearing adult undergarments. So instead, every time he left the house with her, he would bring an extra pair of pants, an extra pair of underwear, baby wipes, and he'd wind up changing her in a tiny bathroom stall at a shopping mall or even in a restaurant. And it was a little maddening. And so it took him quite a while to go through the grief process, the denial, and then there's anger, because he used to say, God, these were supposed to be our golden years. And his golden years were not panning out. And so denial, there's anger, there's depression, obviously. And the last stage is acceptance, when you can really just let go. This is how it is. This is how she is. And if you can get to that point, I'm sorry, um, you're then in a position to reframe the whole situation from I've lost my beloved forever and grieving it like a death to suddenly noticing that even though that person's gone, oh wait, who's this? there's still a human being in the house who's responding like a human being. She responds to touch, to love, to laughter, to caring. And suddenly when you get to that place, it's delightful because it's a mystery. You know, you don't know how she thinks, you don't know what reality how she's perceiving it inside. So it becomes fascinating just to be with her on her terms. So you're reframing a death to a new life. And that was far out, as they say. That was so cool. Um,
Pretty powerful in a way. You have a relationship, and at a time when we are often afraid we're being put out to pasture, there's a new life beckoning there if you can seize it, and go with it. But some of us cannot do that. It's hard to get to that stage where you can let go of what was and embrace what is now.
well,
Um,
especially when what is more and more magical,
True.
right? I one of
But
the examples I give in my book is if you're babysitting, and which is very similar, a 4-year-old, and they say, when I grow up, I'm going to be a princess and we're going to live on the moon. Now, you would not correct a 4-year-old and say, you can't be a princess unless you marry into, a royal family, and the moon doesn't support life. I mean, you'd be a really bad babysitter, right? You just play along and you join them in their fantasy world. And it was the same with my mother.
and have the same kind of experience the babysitter would have a time out of time, a different place to be in for a few hours. So that could be lovely. Turning to a somewhat touchier side of the situation of caregiving, um, not everyone has the financial means to enjoy this phase, and they're often mired in the details and expenses of it. So, are there some, let's say, insights or universal practices that might be helpful for any caregiver, regardless of the resources that they have?
I mean, I was hyper aware that, especially when writing the book, that thinking, well, will people be able to relate to this who don't have the financial means? Because my father, fortunately, had amassed not a fortune, but enough to care for my mom at home. And then when he got some dementia, his pension and Social Security was enough for me to pay for them to stay at home. And I was very conscious that other people don't have that and are up against a whole different set of life challenges to get that handled. And I can't say that I don't know the solution to that. I'm sure every person who's been in that situation has found their own solution, whether it winds up being a Medicaid facility that gets paid for, or scrambling to hold down a job and pay for an aide for a few hours and lose a lot of sleep. I mean, it's impossible. I was very, very lucky and fortunate that we had the financial means. I wanted to go back to something about connection. It occurred to me at one point that a mother with a newborn child, if you think about it, the child does not have a name yet, right? Usually, right away. They have no shared history of things they've done together. The child doesn't understand that it's a baby and this is its mother. So it's all the same qualities. And yet the mother, there's no deeper connection, no more profound feeling of connection than a mother and a newborn have together. And so it was the same when my mother lost, who I was, what we did, our relationship. It was the original connection arose, and I thought that it wasn't me, that it wasn't real because she was so open to everybody who came in the house, which was out of character. She grew up with a lot of fear and stranger danger, and from being living through the Holocaust. So stranger danger. So she seemed to me to be equally open and loving to everybody who came in the house, or even if we took her out to a shopkeeper, but her aides would insist that I got something special, that she gave me something different. I had no way to compare it, but they insisted that she felt something different when I entered the room. And what was also fascinating about having I mean, literally no short-term memory, is that if I was with her in the living room and I walked into the kitchen for 2 minutes, when I came back, her light up as if she hadn't seen me in months, and we were having this grand reunion, after 2 minutes. And eventually, that 2 minutes got down to seconds, meaning I wouldn't have to go to the kitchen. I would just have to go out of her line of eyesight. So I'd be gone and then come back into her line of eyesight and her face would light up again. And we could do this all day long. Um, and that's how that's how you can play peekaboo with a baby because they don't have something called object permanence. So if you put your hands in or a handkerchief in front of your face, you've disappeared. You don't exist. And then you just take it away and the baby is delighted. And it was exactly like that.
That's maybe the lighter side, a good discovery for people to allow themselves to have. Now, even if you have the resources to handle caregiving, it seems that it's an organizational mountain. I've been in numerous types of situations, and the level of management and organization really didn't change, even depending on how many resources the person could pull to make it easier or sometimes more difficult for the person who's care managing. So, could you comment on that a bit? How did you get all of those details together and figure out who was on first?
With great difficulty. Uh, my father was an unusual man. He was a renowned math educator who had lectured around the country to standing room only crowds. He had published over 60 mathematical textbooks, and and yet in terms of him being the care manager, I didn't discover how he was doing that until he had his own issues. He fell down the stairs. He had a traumatic brain injury at the age of 90. And my wife and I happened to be in the area in New Jersey where they live. We were in Virginia, but it was Christmas or something. And we had to move into their house overnight because there was nobody left to fill my father's shoes. And suddenly he couldn't do anything. He couldn't make change of a dollar. I mean, it was heartbreaking to see this mathematical genius in occupational therapy unable to answer, if I give you a $5 bill, how many $1 bills would you give me back? And he was stumped. So I had to step into my father's shoes. I sat at his desk, studied all these scattered papers, and what I realized is he had at different times from 7 to 12 aides, some who came and went, some who were fired, but they all had a different salary. They all had a different payday for some crazy reason, and he paid them all from four different checking accounts. And I was just, I couldn't believe it. And their schedules were scribbled on different pieces of paper. So I had a lot of simplifying to do, get it down to one checkbook, one payday. I had a lot of organizing to do with the aid schedule and posting things on the walls. My wife, who's very good at Excel spreadsheets, she plastered the walls with all sorts of information, that the aides had to take their blood pressure every day and enter it, monitor their bowel movements and enter it, um, phone numbers of all the doctors and neighbors and medicines and how much to take a day. I mean, there was so much to do. Uh, and so I just did it. I had no choice. I had to grow up. I was a late bloomer and I had to grow up instantly. and take this on. And it was a full-time job from 8 in the morning till 10 at night when they were both asleep. And my wife and I would just collapse, exhausted. And that went on for 6 years. And that's without the hands-on stuff, the changing and the feeding and all that.
Yeah, it seems that that's an almost universal experience that suddenly all of this work descends on you. I remember I was 45 and I was able to use a computer to the extent that we had them. I actually taught early versions of Lotus, but my parents' finances were on little pieces of paper, as you said, and just trying to get that all into one place was a nightmare of work. And it had to be done really quickly because my mom hadn't been able to keep up with anything for quite a long time. She concealed it from all of us, but so that was quite something. And I think a lot of people have hit that wall because there is a great divide in terms of computer skills and also capabilities at that point in life. I want
My
to turn.
dad, my dad remained computer literate all the way until he had his traumatic brain injury. But I could sense even before that his own memory was starting to go because he would call me on the phone and say, "El, can you remind me how do I open a Microsoft Word document?" And I would walk him through each step, put the cursor on file, drop down menu, blah, blah, blah. And we'd finally get him to a blank Word document and mission accomplished. The next day, he would call and say, "El, I think I've asked you this before, but do you remember, do you know how do I open, remind me, how do I open a Word document?" And it would take an hour. And I finally realized he was not retaining any of my instructions or guidance, and it made no sense to repeat it every day. So I found one of those programs where I could take over his screen and open a document for him in 2 seconds. And that's before he had brain injury. So he was sort of, gradually getting some dementia, but mostly he was still, quite functioning.
Yeah, the things that we learn more recently, I think, are the first to go, unfortunately. So technology and other more modern ways of doing things are what gets lost just when you need them probably the most. But you had an interesting discovery. Many people write off Alzheimer's patients because they think they can't read anymore or engage in certain types of activities. But tell us what you found about your mom that was so surprising.
Yeah, well, her language skills devolved in different steps. And my brother, a psychologist, he said, "Well, this is really the reverse of how children learn language. A child will learn at some point the distinction between, let's say, people and animals. It's a very big distinction. A little more sophistication, and they'll be able to distinguish a cat from a dog and from a horse, and then a little more sophistication, and they'll know the difference between a collie and a German Shepherd. So they're gradually getting more and more specific. My mother went the opposite direction, where she would start referring to anything mechanical as a machine. So the phone was a machine. I had a video camcorder in those days. That was the machine. Even the car was a machine. So she started with these broad categories, and then her language got to the point where she would speak with English words and English conversational cadence, but made less and less sense. They call it word salad. Like she dumped all her vocabulary in a salad spinner and picked out words at random and we would have conversations that made no sense. I have to go out today, but I don't know who she is, and maybe the mingle man will come, and who knows what'll happen then. And I'll say, "Mom, who knows?" She goes, "Oh, you too." Yeah. And then she started adding more words like the mingle man, words she made up. And it was all, "Well, I have the calendalish today, but we better not arrow spate because the bissen bissen won't happen." And I said, Mom, the bisson won't happen. She goes, oh no. And we talked for, my father couldn't do this, but I was able to get into my brain playful state and just we would talk for a half hour saying nothing to the normal mind. And so her language was devolving until it got to the point where we assumed she had no language left at all. She wasn't speaking and she wasn't reading. Initially she could read a paragraph, not a book anymore. She was an avid reader. Then the paragraph got down to a sentence and then it was all gone. And I happened to come upon her in the living room one day flipping through a magazine and I heard her reading out loud the big print headlines, like three, four words. And I was like, Mom can read? Oh my God, this is amazing. And I ran out to Barnes and Noble and looked for books for Alzheimer's patients or dementia patients. And there wasn't any section like that or any book designed for them. Nowadays there are, but there weren't any. And I scoured the internet, all through Amazon, and I called the National Alzheimer's Association, and they gave me their chief librarian, and I told her I wanted a book for my mom with Alzheimer's, and she said, "Oh, we have 20,000 titles here of caring for an Alzheimer's patient, caregiving." I said, "No, pardon me, but not for the caregiver, which is me. I want something for my mother herself." And there was dead silence on the phone. She was stumped. And it was just amazing to me that with an epidemic this large and so many people out there every year, it's increasing, that no resources were available for the patient. And again, there are now. But back then, I was a pioneer and I thought, well, I guess it's up to me to fill this huge niche. So I came up with a book of each page. Well, it required no memory. That was the main thing. You didn't have to be able to remember anything. You could flip it open, and there would be a beautiful, realistic photograph of something familiar, a bicycle, two old people walking on the beach, whatever, and a three-word caption. It might be a sleeping baby, and the caption was, "The baby is asleep." So it was a resource to give to the aides and my dad to do something with my mother other than park her in front of a television set and play the 9 DVD set of Dean Martin's Comedy Hour, which she had seen 100 times. And she really enjoyed the book because she would flip through it and find out of the 20 photos, maybe five that she returned to again and again. One of little children, one of that elderly couple, and she would stroke their faces and contemplate the photo for 5, 10 minutes, sometimes reading the captions, sometimes not. But so that book was called Blue Sky, White Clouds, the picture book for memory challenged adults. Um, yeah, I think that's the whole story.
Fascinating, because we know that music often awakens communication possibilities for Alzheimer's patients. And are there other creative tools that you would recommend to other caregivers
Well,
that
there's
would?
been so much research and films, documentaries and videos about music. I mean, that's well known now that even if a patient has forgotten everything, if you put on a song from their era, all the words will come back and they'll sing along and they'll be really, their faces will light up. And so, yeah, there was a lot of I was a music major in college, so there was a lot of music in our house. My father, especially, would always go, "Let's have a party." And what a party meant was I'd have to lug out my big, heavy keyboard and plug it in and bring out the show tunes or whatever it was. And he had a best friend, a female friend, former student, who was a singer in community theater. So we would play all these old time songs. The aides would sing along, and sometimes we would just sing to my mother, or I would play songs I remember she loved when I was just learning piano at 5 years old. I dug up the old sheet music and I played those. And yeah, she delighted in music, even to the point where she once sat at the piano next to me, picked the note, and played it over and over again, but it was in perfect time. One, two, three, four, boom, boom. And I would improvise on top of it a melody. And it was a collaboration, a creative collaboration that we both really felt fulfilled by. It was really fun. Like making music with someone is always fun.
That's lovely. I think there's so much we need to learn about how the brain works and how it fails, and what you can still find even after it seems like there's nothing left. And what a tragedy that we didn't really know that people still had it in them to do these things. So lovely to hear how your family was able to, at least in some part, handle this.
And when they were both mobile, I would put on music and they would dance in the living room. And that had never happened. I had never seen my parents doing ballroom dancing in our living room. So that was really nice to see. It was very touching. So, yeah, the arts, music, dance, and so forth. Yeah. I know there's people who use drawing and painting as well. I didn't try that for some reason.
Oh, it sounds like you got quite a bit from the words and the photography. So that
Yeah.
was. And you can't make someone be busy all day either. We sometimes try to cram in a lot of activities because we think that's but people need a rest too. It is exhausting, I think, in
Well,
some.
it, we weren't cramming in activities. She barely had any activities. That was the whole point. She was watching TV all day or sleeping. So I was just trying to inject a few little things to break up the day and make it a little more alive and interesting for her.
Right. Some people get preoccupied with a lot of doctor visits. So that's another problem. How do you make for lighter moments, to keep it heartwarming at the same time that you have to go through all the other things. You mentioned a little bit before about how your relationship changed with your mom when she became that radiant little girl again. What surprised you most about the emotional repair that happened late in life? You described earlier the earlier life. So what was the contrast that was so surprising for you?
Well, I think I said that earlier. We had a difficult mother-son relationship throughout most of my adult life, even as I struggled to make it right, going to therapy, hugging her, even though we never used to touch. I would do the things to try to fix this. And it was just a miracle that all of that dropped away almost instantly once she transformed. I have to give, it was really her that changed. My change was natural and just happened because you'd have to be so hard-hearted to not appreciate this childlike being, right? What was I going to do? Still be mad at her for what she did when I was 12? I mean, it was nuts. So,
Having,
yeah.
do you find that your sense of family or aging or love have changed in some way that might be helpful for caregivers to understand?
Can you say that another way? I'm not sure what you mean.
Um, you probably went into this with knowing your own past, that you had a difficult, challenging time. But once you cross the bridge into this is a new person now that I can get to know, did that put a different spin on your own feelings about family moving forward?
Well, I mean, I'm like most people, this is not what you want to hear. It it instilled fear in me that I could be going the same direction. Um, I actually signed up to go for a neurocognitive workup next month because I'm starting to notice like in conversations like these, I can lose my train of thought, and that didn't used to happen to me, or miss a word. And yeah, I mean, there's fear, and on the other hand, having seen that my mother didn't suffer much, um, it makes it a little less fearful. You know, as my wife likes to say, I think like mom, you're going to be happier without your memories too, because I was pretty much a lifelong depressive, and you know, if some of that emotional stuff left me, I might end up being a happy camper also. Whereas my brother literally s- took me off took me off being his healthcare proxy and his power of attorney because he was terrified that he would be like my mother, unable to communicate, and I would insist that, you know, to keeping him alive. He was afraid I'd keep him alive longer than he wanted to be. So he needed someone who'd be willing to pull the plug on him. But you know, I don't know. I'll enter it with curiosity if I go that route. At least at first, I think I'll be curious about it. Probably more aware than my mother ever was. She was in denial herself. I mean, the very first time I brought it up early, you know, 20 years before she passed, you know, she had driven home from the local shopping mall that was literally 5 minutes away. And she had been going there 2 to 3 times a week for 50 years, and she got lost. And I said, Mom, that doesn't sound right. You know, maybe we should get you checked out. And she said, You would have gotten lost too. It was very dark out. And I immediately realized that we were probably not going to be having a frank and open discussion with her, and it wasn't my place to force that. You know, she would have to be open and willing and wanting to talk about it. I mean, she was a little aware that because she and my father would memorize the names of the Supreme Court justices and test each other to demonstrate that they still had their memory. But
The
yeah,
family.
I don't know what the future holds, but
Um, if a caregiver is listening today to our interview and they can only remember one thing from what you said, what would you hope it would be? What would you want them to take away that they could hold on to when the days are hard?
yeah, that connection, loving connection, is the single most important aspect to focus on, be aware of, and be grateful for, rather than ruminate and mentally, obsessively stay attached to the content, the story, whether they know me, whether they know my name, whether they recognize my child or remember that they're the grandmother. All that stuff is not what's important. What's important is a soulful, emotional, mental connection. And it means it makes all the difference because
Just
that's
like
what we,
the infant,
sorry,
like you said before about responding to the infant who is starting over.
right.
If
It's a very deep connection and it's fulfilling. And
yeah,
we never would have suspected that beforehand.
yeah, a lot of people end this kind of episode in anger and frustration and sadness. And how much better for you if you could come through with happiness and warmth that you've been describing. So I don't want to end this before we give people a chance to find your book, The Silver Linings of Alzheimer's, and also your picture books if they're still available, so people
Yeah,
can experience. We'll put everything in the show notes for everyone, but could you tell us where to go first? What can we look for?
sure. It's the silver lining, um, singular, the silver lining of Alzheimer's, one son's journey into the mystery. And that has its own website, LME Press, ELEMI Press, PRESS, LMEpress.com. And that tells a little of our story. There's pictures of my family, and it directs you to either download the book as an ebook or it'll send you to Amazon. or you can go straight to Amazon if you want to skip my website. You can get it there. Uh, and Blue Sky, White Clouds also is on Amazon. Or you could try blueskywhiteclouds.com and get more background on a different website of mine, which is under my name, eliezer.sobel.com, which lists my other 8 books as well. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Deborah. One thing I do want to reiterate is that this book is not a Pollyanna book. It doesn't say it's all going to be okay, cheer up. It acknowledges the horrors of the disease and the difficulties that we and I know other families all go through. It doesn't, in other words, it doesn't sugarcoat the disease at all. Um, like I said earlier, we had a period where we couldn't handle my mom at home anymore because she was ripping up ancient, beautiful photos. She was throwing heavy objects at the wall, or once chasing the aides with a kitchen knife around the house, and it was too much. And we had to put her in a psych ward, and which was horrible. The whole other story. It was horrible, but we were lucky that one doctor found a pill, a magic pill that calmed the edginess, the anger, and the violence, but not so much that it sedated her. So it didn't just put her to sleep. And, the thing I dreaded, I had been to enough memory units. I did not want to see my mother as another old lady slumped over in a wheelchair, ignored. That's just such a sad sight. And my parents had promised each other they would never do that, because they visited a few when they were in their late 70s, and they said, "Oh, these are all such old people. I promise I won't put you there." And they stuck to that promise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tricky promise a lot of us make and then find out this is too overwhelming for me. So that's one of the darker sides of caregiving at this point in life. But you certainly have brought to us today a silver lining. And I'm so delighted that we could peek in there with you. Sometimes it's a matter of getting the meds straightened out and then life can go on smoothly for a while. And other times it's a matter of appreciating the joyful persona that you have now rediscovered or discovered for the first time. So I very much appreciate this long conversation about so many different things that it's a body of knowledge that's hard to acquire because people who are living through it don't have time to talk for obvious reasons. And sometimes people don't want to talk about it once it's over because there's just so much. So, Eliezer, thank you very much for being my guest today. And I hope you'll come back and share more insights as they come to you. And take good care of your brain. This is at this
Yeah.
point. So, thank
Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for this opportunity. Yeah, to
you.
share.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening today. So I hope you will tune in next week for another episode of the Sharegiving Secret. Thank you for joining me today on the Sharegiving Secret. I love sharing insights and stories to empower you on your caregiving journey. If you like what you hear, you can dive deeper by picking up a copy of my pamphlet, Non-Negotiables for Caregivers. Go to my website, DeborahGreenhut.com, and click on the link for Non-Negotiables for Caregivers. Until next time, keep sharing, keep caring, and remember, you're not alone on this journey. Thank you for listening.